Welcome back to Payback Logs. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. The air out here on the coast doesn't just blow, it breathes. It carries the scent of damp cedar, crushed oyster shells, and the sharp, cold promise of a Pacific storm. I've spent 30 years breathing this air, first as a field agent and eventually as regional director for the EPA. You'd think a man who spent 3 decades navigating federal bureaucracies and environmental litigation would want a condo in the city or a golf course in the desert, but I chose the Cove. The Cove is 50 acres of what the developers call underutilized shoreline. To me, it's a living lung. It's where the freshwater marsh meets the salt tide, a delicate clockwork of life that doesn't care about quarterly profits or zoning boards. I have a ritual. Every morning at 6 a.m., I lace up my LL Bean boots, the ones with the salt-stained leather and the worn-down tread, and I walk the perimeter. I carry a weathered leather field notebook and a vintage Leica M6. I don't take pictures of people, I take pictures of the way the light hits the eelgrass. I was at the northern edge of the property, near the old cedar grove, when I felt the first crack in my piece. It wasn't a sound, it was a sight. Tucked deep into the tall beach grass, nearly invisible unless you were looking for a topographical marker, was a stake, fresh pine tipped with neon orange spray paint. It wasn't a property marker. I know where my lines are down to the inch. This was a surveyor's stake for a centerline grade. Someone had been on my land, measuring the slope for a road. I stood there for a long time, the wind whipping the tails of my waxed canvas jacket. I checked my watch, a heavy mechanical diver's watch that had seen the bottom of the Columbia River more than once. 10:15 a.m. I heard the crunch of gravel before I saw the vehicle, a white luxury SUV, the kind that cost more than a year of my pension, came crawling up the private drive like a predatory shark. Out stepped Vanessa, my daughter-in-law. She was wearing a cream-colored coat that looked like it had never seen a raindrop, and heels that were currently sinking into the soft Pacific mud. "Arthur!" she called out, her voice bright and artificial, like a bird call made of plastic. "I thought I'd find you out here in the weeds. You're becoming quite the hermit, aren't you?" She wasn't alone. A young man followed her, wearing a slim-fit suit and carrying a tablet. He looked like the kind of person who uses the word synergy without irony. "Vanessa," I said, tipping my cap. I didn't move toward her. I stayed by the orange stake. "Vanessa, I didn't know we had a meeting scheduled, and I certainly didn't know I'd invited a surveyor onto the Cove." Vanessa didn't flinch. She just gave me that pitying smile she's been perfecting since my wife, Elena, passed away. "Oh, Arthur," she said, "this is Julian. He's with a firm I'm consulting with. We're just doing some preliminary assessments. You know how the damp is out here. It's not good for your lungs or the foundation of the main house. We're just looking at ways to revitalize the space, for your benefit, of course." "The foundation is fine, Vanessa. It's sat on granite for 80 years. My voice was level, the same voice I used when I had to tell a chemical company they were being fined 6 figures for a leak. And Julian here seems to be looking at a grade line, not a foundation." Vanessa laughed, a sharp, tittering sound that was lost to the wind. "You're so literal, Arthur. That's why we love you. But honestly, this place is such a waste of space in its current state. It needs a modern touch, someone to bring it into the 21st century." She looked at the marsh with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. To her, it was a swamp. To me, it was Elena's favorite place on earth. I noted the name of the firm on Julian's tablet, Cascadia Horizon Partners. I didn't say another word. I just watched them as they climbed back into the white SUV and retreated toward the main house. I walked back to the stake. I didn't pull it up. In my experience, if you pull up a surveyor's stake too early, they just plant two more. You have to let them think they're invisible. You have to let them think you're just an old man who likes to take pictures of grass. I opened my field notebook to a fresh page. 10:45 a.m. Cascadia Horizon Partners. Grade markers found at North Sector. Vanessa claims revitalization. Tone, condescending. Narrative, incompetence. I looked out at the water. The tide was coming in. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Vanessa was a social climber. She wanted the city life, the galas, the board seats, and she'd realized that my 50 acres of swamp was the only thing standing between her and a very large pile of money. I'm going to let that sit for a moment. Keep listening. Over the next few weeks, Vanessa not only moved into the main house, she tried to move me out of my own life. She began a campaign of subtle, high society warfare, treating the cove like a blank canvas and me like a stubborn stain on the floorboards.
It started with the Modernization Initiative. One morning, I returned from my walk to find two men in overalls carrying my mahogany desk out of the study and toward the guest cottage, a drafty one-bedroom shack near the equipment shed that hadn't been lived in since the 90s. "What's going on here?" I asked, stopping them at the porch. Vanessa appeared from the kitchen, holding a tablet and a steaming cup of tea that smelled of something expensive and floral. "Oh, Arthur, you're back. I'm just helping you declutter. Julian and I agreed that the main house needs a breathable aesthetic for the upcoming charity mixer. That old desk was so heavy, so oppressive. The cottage is much more your speed, isn't it? It's closer to your birds." "My desk stays where it is, Vanessa," I said. She sighed, that practiced, weary sound she used to signal to the world that she was the long-suffering martyr taking care of a difficult elder. "Arthur, we talked about this at dinner, don't you remember? You said you wanted a quieter space to work on your little book. You were so excited about it." We hadn't had dinner together in 3 days. I hadn't mentioned a book. "I don't remember that, Vanessa, because it didn't happen." She stepped closer, her voice dropping into a tone of forced, oily sweetness that made the hair on my arms stand up. "This is what I was telling Sarah, Arthur. The lapses, they're becoming more frequent. It's the salt air. It's fatiguing for you. You need a simpler environment, less to manage, less to forget." She was planting the seeds. In the 30 years I'd spent at the EPA, I'd seen this move before. It's what we called preemptive discrediting. If I complained about the surveyors or the developers later, she'd already have the family and the neighbors convinced that I was just a confused old man tilting at windmills. The charity mixer was the centerpiece of her strategy. She invited the local movers and shakers, city council members, real estate moguls, and the kind of people who think a conservation easement is a personal insult. I watched from the sidelines, wearing my old tweed jacket, feeling like a ghost at my own funeral. Vanessa moved through the crowd like a queen, gesturing toward the marsh with a manicured hand. "We're so excited to finally revitalize the cove," I heard her tell a woman in a fur stole. "It's been neglected for so long. Arthur has done his best, bless him, but he's just not up to the task of modern stewardship. We're looking at a low-impact residential community that really honors the spirit of the land." Low impact is developer speak for "we're going to pave over everything but the name." I approached a man I recognized, a local councilman named Holloway. "Vanessa tells me you're looking at a revitalization plan, Arthur," he said, swirling his scotch. "Brave move. Most people your age just sit on the land until the taxes eat them alive. She says you've been consulting on the zoning changes." "I haven't consulted on anything, Holloway," I said, And as far as I'm concerned, the only thing being revitalized tonight is my guest list. Vanessa was at my elbow in an instant. "Oh, Arthur, you're being so droll. Councilman, you'll have to forgive him. He's had a very long day with his binoculars. Why don't we go find some appetizers, dear?" She steered me away with a grip that was surprisingly strong. When we were out of earshot, the mask slipped. Her eyes were as cold as a winter tide. "Don't embarrass me, Arthur," she hissed. "I'm trying to save this family's future. You're sitting on $40 million of dirt while we're struggling to maintain the lifestyle you're currently enjoying for free. I've already spoken to the lawyers. If you continue to be difficult, we'll have to look at a formal competency hearing. Do you really want to spend your last years in a courtroom?" "I've spent my life in courtrooms, Vanessa," I said, my voice as dry as parchment. "I find the acoustics are excellent for hearing the truth." I walked away from her and went to the guest cottage. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat by the window and watched the headlights of the luxury cars as they filtered out of my driveway. I reached for my field notebook. I didn't write about the birds. I wrote down the names of every guest I'd recognized. I wrote down the name of the firm on the councilman's business card. She thought she was gaslighting me. She thought by moving my desk she was moving my mind. She didn't realize that a man who has spent 30 years hunting corporate polluters doesn't need a desk to do an audit. He just needs a target. I'm going to let that sit for a moment. Keep listening. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. The charity crowd finally cleared out, leaving the house smelling of expensive perfume and cheap ambition. I didn't go back to the main house. I stayed in the cottage, surrounded by the shadows of my old life. The silence out here is different. It's not empty, it's expectant.
I woke up at 4 in the morning, long before Vanessa's alarm would trigger her daily power yoga. I walked down to the shoreline, the dew soaking through my boots. The fog was thick, a gray shroud that made the world feel small and private. I headed for the Heritage Oak. It's a massive, gnarled tree that sits on a slight rise overlooking the marsh. It's been here since before the settlers, and it was the first thing Elena fell in love with when we bought this land 40 years ago. Elena. I've only mentioned her name once since the funeral, and even then I had to swallow hard to get the syllables out. She was the one who taught me how to truly see the cove. I was the scientist, the man of regulations and parts per million. She was the soul. She could tell you the difference between a great blue heron and a little blue just by the way they held their necks in flight. "Arthur," she'd told me one evening, sitting under this very tree, "we don't own this land. We're just the guards at the gate. If we do our job right, the gate stays closed." She'd spent her life making sure the gate stayed shut. She'd fought the local utility when they wanted to run lines through the marsh. She organized the neighbors when a timber company tried to clear-cut the cedar grove. She was the reason this place was still wild. I sat at the base of the oak, my back against the rough, familiar bark. I closed my eyes, and I could almost hear her, the specific low hum she'd make when she was sketching the wildflowers. I could smell her, a mixture of damp earth, rose water, and the peppermint tea she always carried in a thermos. She's been gone 2 years, and the world has felt like it's lost its color. But the cove was her masterpiece. Every bird that nested in the reeds was a victory she'd won. I opened my eyes and looked toward the marsh. The fog was lifting, revealing the silver-gray expanse of the wetlands. But something was wrong. In the distance, near the tidal pool where the herons usually gathered, I saw a flash of white. I walked toward it, my professional instincts, the ones I'd spent 30 years honing, starting to hum in the back of my mind. It was a great egret. It was lying on its side in the mud, its long, elegant neck twisted. It wasn't just dead. It looked scorched. I knelt beside it, not touching it yet. I looked at the water. It didn't have the clear, brackish tea color it should have. There was a faint, oily sheen on the surface, a rainbow-colored film that didn't belong in a pristine marsh. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small glass vial, a habit from my days in the field. I took a sample of the water. Then I looked at the mud. There were tracks. Not bird tracks, not deer. Heavy, deep ruts from a vehicle, a drill rig. My heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Vanessa thought she was playing a game of social status. She thought she was just modernizing a piece of real estate. She didn't realize that she had just committed a federal environmental violation on land under my protection. I stood up, the vial cold in my hand. I looked at the heritage oak, then back at the main house where Vanessa was likely sleeping, dreaming of her city galas. The gate is closed, Elena. I'm going to make sure it stays that way. I didn't go back to the cottage. I went to the old shed where I kept my professional equipment, the stuff the EPA lets you keep when you've served as long as I have. My testing kits, my encrypted laptop, my maps. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my chest, but now it had an edge to it. Vanessa had made a mistake. She treated the earth like it was a line item on a balance sheet. She'd forgotten that the earth has laws of its own, and I was the man who knew how to enforce them. I went to work. I didn't need the sun to see what I was doing. I let the house grow dark. There's something about the way a coastal cottage feels at night, the way the fog presses against the glass, that makes the mind move more precisely. I didn't need the overhead lights. The blue glow from my ruggedized laptop was enough. This was my old cockpit, the place where I dismantled the careers of corporate polluters, from the copper mines of Montana to the refineries of the Gulf. Vanessa thought I was a relic. She didn't realize that for 30 years, I was the man who decided what clean meant for the United States government.
I began the quiet audit by accessing the NEPA database. In my line of work, we have a saying, you can hide the money in a shell company, but you can't hide the carbon in the soil. I pulled up the pending permit applications for our county. I found it within 10 minutes. Application 992 Delta. The applicant wasn't Vanessa, it was Cascadia Horizon Partners. They were filing for a categorical exclusion to bypass a full environmental impact statement, EIS. To get that exclusion, they had to prove the land was environmentally degraded and lacked significant wetland function. I opened the digital folder and saw the expert report they'd submitted. It was signed by a junior consultant I recognized, a boy who'd been fired from the state board for flexibility with data. The report claimed the Cove's marsh was a non-contiguous seasonal drainage ditch with no connection to the navigable waters of the Pacific. It was a blatant, calculated lie. If that report stood, the land could be drained, filled, and paved without a single federal review. But here was the part that made my blood run cold. The report included a signature of consent from the property manager and heir apparent, Vanessa. She hadn't just listed the land for sale, she had signed a secret development easement for a $3 million consulting fee, a kickback hidden in an offshore escrow account. She was selling the Cove as a brownfield while it was still breathing. I sat back, the blue light reflecting off the sample vial I'd taken from the marsh. The oily sheen I'd seen wasn't an accident. In the world of high-stakes development, this is called environmental sabotage. They were intentionally contaminating the water table with drilling lubricants to make the land appear degraded during a site inspection. If it's already polluted, it's easier to get the permit to pave it over. I'll tell you what, Vanessa, I whispered to the empty room. "You wanted to play in the big leagues. You wanted to move Earth like a titan, but you forgot that I'm the man who wrote the manual on Section 404 of the Clean Water Act." I started making my own moves. I didn't reach for a lawyer. In a fight against the federal government, a lawyer is just a paper shuffler. You need an inspector general. I accessed the EPA's secure portal using my emeritus credentials. I didn't file a complaint. I filed a request for jurisdictional determination. Because the cove has a tidal connection, it falls under the Rapano standard for federal jurisdiction. By filing this request, I was effectively placing a federal hold on any state or local zoning changes. Every document Vanessa had signed, every promise she'd made to the councilman, was now subject to a mandatory review by the Army Corps of Engineers. But then I saw the secondary paper trail. Vanessa wasn't just using the land as collateral, she was using my signature, the one she'd assisted me with on a medical proxy form, to authorize the drilling. She was framing me. If the EPA came in and found the pollution, she'd point to the papers and say, "Arthur was trying a DIY reclamation project. He's confused. He's the one who authorized the drills." She was making me the villain in Elena's story. I felt a cold, surgical detachment. The grief was still there, but it was being armored by a decade of regulatory steel. I wasn't just a husband anymore. I was a regional director, and I'd just found a Class 1 violation in my own backyard. I noted the timestamp of the sabotage drilling. I noted the GPS coordinates of the orange stakes. I filed it all in a secure cloud drive that Brent or Julian couldn't touch. I didn't sleep. At 4 a.m., I went to the equipment shed. I pulled out my old YSI multi-parameter water quality meter. It's a professional-grade tool that measures dissolved oxygen, pH, and conductivity. I've used it to shut down paper mills that were poisoning the salmon runs. I walked out to the marsh in the pre-dawn light. I wasn't taking pictures this time. I was taking data. Every reading was a nail in the coffin of Vanessa's revitalization. She thought I was the prey because I moved a little slower and I liked to talk to the birds. She didn't know that in the world of federal environmental law, I'm the one who sets the season and defines the take. And for Vanessa, the season was about to close. I'm going to let that sit for a moment. Keep listening. The fog was beginning to lift, but the air remained heavy with the smell of salt and that oily chemical tang I'd discovered at the waterline. I was heading back towards the cottage when I saw my grandson, Leo. He was 10 years old, with Elena's wide, observant eyes and a curious mind that usually kept him occupied with tide pools and fossil hunting. But this morning he wasn't looking for fossils. He was sitting on the back porch of the main house, staring at a sleek, high-end tablet in his hands. He looked up when he saw me, and for the first time in his life, he didn't run over to tell me what he'd found. He looked guilty.
"Hey there, Leo," I said, leaning against the railing. I kept my voice light, though my hands were still stained with the marsh mud. "That's a fancy piece of equipment. I didn't know you were into the digital stuff now." Leo looked down at the tablet. It was the latest model, the kind that costs more than a month of groceries. "Mom gave it to me," he whispered. "She said it's a moving gift, because we're going to live in the city soon, and I won't have the cove to play in anymore." I felt a sharp, cold jab in my chest. Vanessa wasn't just gaslighting me, she was bribing my grandson to accept the destruction of his own heritage. "The city, huh? Did she tell you why we're moving?" "She said you're tired, Grandpa," said Leo, his voice trembling. "She said you don't want to take care of the birds anymore because it makes you sad about Grandma. She said you're selling the land so we can be properly looked after in a place with better doctors. That dog won't hunt." Vanessa had turned the truth inside out.
She was using my grief as a weapon against my grandson's affection for me. She was telling him that I was the one abandoning the land, that I was the one who didn't care about Elena's masterpiece. She was buying his silence with a piece of glass and a lie, ensuring that when the bulldozers eventually came, Leo would blame me instead of her. "Leo," I said, sitting beside him. I smelled the cedar on his jacket and felt the weight of the betrayal. "I want you to listen to me very carefully. Your grandmother and I spent 40 years making sure this land stayed wild so that you would have it. I am not tired, and I am certainly not selling the cove." Leo looked at the tablet, then back at me. "But Mom said the papers are already signed. She said Julian is going to build a discovery park here." "A discovery park is just a fancy name for a parking lot with a few potted plants, Leo. And those papers, well, let's just say they weren't written with a straight pen." I looked at the tablet. I knew exactly where the money for that gift came from. It was the earnest money from Cascadia Horizon Partners, a down payment on the destruction of the wetlands Leo loved. Vanessa was literally funding her son's distraction with the blood of the land he loved. The mission changed in that moment. Before, I was defending a regulatory boundary. Now, I was defending a boy's soul. I was making sure that when Leo looked back at his childhood, he didn't see a grandfather who gave up, but a man who stood his ground when the wind got high. "Leo," I said, "do me a favor. Keep that tablet, but don't let it tell you what to see. Tomorrow morning, I want you to meet me at the Heritage Oak at dawn. I have something to show you that a screen can't capture." "Okay, Grandpa," he said, and I saw a flicker of the old Leo behind his eyes. I stood up and walked away, my boots crunching on the gravel. I could feel Vanessa watching me from the kitchen window. I didn't look back. I knew she was probably smiling, thinking she'd successfully bought the last of the loyalties in this house. She didn't realize that in my line of work, we have a term for what she was doing: coercion of a minor beneficiary. It's a specialized form of fraud that federal investigators take very, very seriously. I went back to the shed and pulled out my old field radio. It was time to stop being the old man and start being the regional director again. I had a phone call to make to the Department of Justice's Environmental Crime Section. The trap was no longer just about water quality and zoning. It was about the boy on the porch. And Vanessa was about to learn that you can't pave over a man's character just because you bought his grandson a toy. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. Thank you, for real. The fog didn't just lift, it retreated, leaving the cove exposed in a way that felt raw and vulnerable. I spent the next 48 hours moving with a purpose that hadn't stirred in me in years. I was constructing the invisible trap. In the regulatory world, we call this a statutory pincer maneuver. You let the target move forward until they've committed enough violations that every exit is a federal felony.
Vanessa was already planning her victory toast. She'd scheduled a final site walkthrough with the developers from Cascadia Horizon Partners and Councilman Halloway. She thought she was leading them to a gold mine. She didn't realize I was leading her to a Section 404 enforcement action. Layer 1. The Critical Habitat Designation. I didn't just take water samples. I documented the presence of the western snowy plover and a rare species of coastal marsh willow that Elena had spent years protecting. I uploaded these findings, along with my GPS-stamped photos, to the Federal Register. By doing this, I didn't just make the land difficult to build on, I made it a critical habitat. Under the Endangered Species Act, any unauthorized take or modification of this habitat carries criminal penalties. Layer 2. The Federal Review Trigger. I contacted the Army Corps of Engineers. Because Vanessa had authorized the drilling, which I had documented as having contaminated the water table, I triggered an emergency Section 10 review. This effectively bypassed the state's categorical exclusion that Vanessa had been counting on. The developers thought they were dealing with a local zoning issue. They didn't know the federal government had just put a biological opinion freeze on the entire 50 acres. Layer 3, the document trail. I allowed Vanessa to find a set of old unfiled maps in my study. I made sure they looked like they'd been forgotten. These maps showed the drainage ditches Julian had described, but I had annotated them with the historical tidal data from 1950, proving they were navigable waters of the United States. I knew Vanessa would hand them over to Julian to try and refute them. In doing so, she would be submitting falsified evidence to a federal agency. Layer 4, the final invitation. I played the part of the defeated old man to perfection. I told Vanessa I wanted to have a drink with her and her partners under the heritage oak on Friday afternoon. "I want to say goodbye to the tree, Vanessa," I told her, my voice sounding thin and weary. "Let's have a toast to the modern future of the cove." She was so smug she actually patted my hand. "That's very gracious of you, Arthur. It's the right thing to do, for everyone." I spent Friday morning in the shed, but I wasn't cleaning my binoculars. I was checking the frequency on my old field radio and printing out the cease and desist order I'd drafted, the one that carried the official seal of the Environmental Protection Agency. I looked at the black field notebook. Every transaction, every bribe disguised as a moving gift, and every drop of oil in the marsh was logged. Vanessa believed that because she had the councilman in her pocket and a developer's check in her hand, she had won. She didn't understand that I wasn't fighting for the land anymore. I was the land, and I was about to show her exactly what happens when you try to pave over a man who spent 30 years writing the laws that protect the earth. She had 3 hours. She did not know that. The sun was hanging low over the Pacific, turning the marsh into a sheet of hammered gold. It was a beautiful afternoon, if you didn't know about the poison in the water and the lies in the paperwork. Vanessa had set up a small table under the heritage oak. She'd brought crystal glasses and a bottle of champagne that probably cost as much as my first car. She was wearing a white linen dress, looking every bit the new mistress of the estate. Flanked by Julian and Councilman Halloway, they were laughing, pointing at the shoreline, already mentally dividing the land into half-acre lots.
"Arthur, there you are," Vanessa called out as I approached. She was beaming, the kind of radiant glow you only see on someone who thinks they've just successfully buried their past. "We were just about to pour. Julian was just telling us how the Discovery Park is going to be the centerpiece of the new development. Isn't it wonderful?" I didn't say a word. I was wearing my old EPA field jacket, the one with the faded patch on the shoulder and the pockets full of notebooks. I stood a few feet away from their little celebration, my boots planted firmly in the grass Elena had loved. "It's a very clean plan, Julian," I said, my voice dry and level. "A bit too clean, actually, especially for a property that's currently under a federal jurisdictional hold." The laughter died instantly. Julian's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Councilman Holloway cleared his throat, a nervous, jagged sound. "Arthur, dear," said Vanessa, her voice tightening with that familiar managing the elder tone, "you're being droll again. We've already cleared the state hurdles. The categorical exclusion is in place. Everything is above board." "The state hurdles are just the warm-up, Vanessa," I said. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a thick, blue-bound folder. "This is a Section 404C veto initiation. As a former regional director, I still keep a very close eye on the Federal Register. and I've noticed a few discrepancies in your application." Julian stepped forward, trying to look imposing. "Now look here, Mr. Sterling. We have an environmental report that says this land is degraded. It's seasonal drainage at best. We've done the surveys." "I know you did," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I saw your drill rigs, and more importantly, my YSI water quality meter saw what your rigs left behind. Exhibit A, soil and water samples taken 3 days ago. They show high concentrations of industrial-grade lubricants, the kind used specifically to suppress microbial activity in wetlands to make them appear dead for site inspections." Holloway's face went the color of ash. "Lubricants? Julian, what is he talking about?" "He's talking about environmental sabotage, Councilman," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The quietness of the woods did the work for me. "But that's just the plumbing. Let's talk about the birds." I looked at Vanessa. She was clutching her glass so hard I thought it might shatter. "I spent 40 years with a woman who taught me that the earth keeps its own records. Vanessa, you signed a statement saying there were no species of concern on this property. But while you were hosting your charity mixers, I was documenting the nesting pair of western snowy plovers in the north sector. I filed the critical habitat designation yesterday morning." You can't just do that," Vanessa hissed, her mask finally cracking. "This is my house. This is my inheritance. You're just a pathetic old man talking to ghosts." "I'm not talking to ghosts," I said quietly. I looked up at the heritage oak, its branches heavy and silent above us. "I'm listening to the land, and the land says you're finished." I watched as Miller's team began cordoning off the north sector with yellow tape, EPA crime scene tape. I watched as Julian was led to the SUV to answer some questions about the drilling lubricants, and I watched Councilman Holloway practically trip over himself trying to get to his car and distance himself from the toxic mess Vanessa had made. Vanessa didn't cry. She just stood there, her white dress stained with the salt air, looking at the 50 acres she had tried to kill. She looked at me, and for the first time, she didn't see an old man. She saw the regional director. "You're leaving, Vanessa," I said. "The house is being placed back into the Elena Sterling Conservation Trust. I've already revoked your management proxy. You have 2 hours to pack your bags. If you touch so much as a silver spoon that isn't yours, Miller here will add larceny to your list of problems." She didn't say a word. She turned and walked towards the house, her heels sinking deep into the mud one last time. I stood there alone under the oak. The champagne bottle was still on the table, the bubbles going flat in the cold air. I didn't pour a glass. I just picked up my field notebook and wrote one final entry for the day. 17:30. North sector secured. Threat neutralized. The plovers are still nesting. I looked out at the marsh. The tide was all the way in now, the silver water covering the oily film, washing the land clean. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a weight I'd been carrying since the funeral. The gate was closed. 6 months later, the cove has a different kind of silence. It's no longer the silence of a house under siege, but the deep, resonant quiet of a place that knows it's safe.
The federal case against Cascadia Horizon Partners moved with a speed that surprised even me. When you present the Department of Justice with a paper trail that includes environmental sabotage and wire fraud, they don't tend to dither. Julian is currently awaiting sentencing for the falsification of federal documents. Councilman Holloway resigned his seat for personal reasons, though anyone who reads the local blotter knows his name was all over the subpoenas. Vanessa didn't go to prison, but she came a cropper in every other way. The civil penalties from the EPA for the unauthorized drilling wiped out her savings, and the consulting fee she thought was hers was seized as the proceeds of a crime. Last I heard, she was living in a small apartment in the city, working a mid-level marketing job. The social circles she craved have closed their doors to her. In that world, a federal investigation is a stain no amount of dry cleaning can remove. The main house is quiet again. I moved my mahogany desk back into the study myself. It's back in its rightful place, overlooking the marsh. It's Saturday morning. The air is sharp, tasting of the first frost and the coming winter. I'm standing under the heritage oak with Leo. He's not holding a tablet today. He's holding a pair of my old Nikon binoculars, the ones with the worn rubber casing and the optics that can spot a needle in a haystack. "There, Grandpa," he whispers, pointing toward the tidal pool. "Is that him?" I look through my own glass. A great blue heron is standing perfectly still in the reeds, a silhouette of prehistoric grace against the silver water. "That's him, Leo," I say, resting a hand on his shoulder. "He's a sentinel. He's making sure everything is in its right place." Leo watches the bird for a long time. "I'm glad we didn't move, Grandpa. The city doesn't have birds like that." "No," I say, resting a hand on his shoulder. "It doesn't." I've placed the entire 50 acres into a permanent conservation easement. It's no longer just a piece of property. It's a protected sanctuary named in honor of Elena. It can never be sold, never be paved, and never be revitalized by anyone with a surveyor's stake and a greedy heart. The gate is not just closed, it's locked, and I've thrown away the key. I open my leather field notebook to the very last page. I don't write about regulations or parts per million. I don't write about Vanessa or the developers. I write about the way the light is hitting the water and the way the heron looks as it takes flight, its wings beating a slow, steady rhythm against the sky. I think about Elena. I think about the 40 years we spent being the guards at the gate. I realized then that she was right. We never owned this land. We were just its temporary stewards, its witnesses, and I had fulfilled my final audit. I look at my watch, 0800, time to head back for breakfast. I reach out and touch the bark of the oak one last time. It feels warm despite the frost. I feel a sense of peace that has nothing to do with victory and everything to do with honor. Nature has a way of reclaiming what was stolen if you know where to look, and I've always been very good at looking.